Good evening, and a very warm welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Jane Gordon. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs here at the Society, and we are delighted tonight to have so many of you here. By way of introduction, I just want to mention that about a week and a half ago, I was in Gettysburg, going down to my brother's in Virginia, and looking at so many of the memorials that are scattered across what was the battlefield at Gettysburg. And I'm realizing from Mr. Adams, our speaker tonight, that there are over 2,000 of those memorials, but there is only one of those memorials dedicated to a physician, and he is the subject of our talk tonight. His name was Zabdiel Boylston Adams. He was an 1853 graduate of Harvard Medical School, and we will find out very shortly exactly why he is the person who definitely deserves that medal on the battlefield at Gettysburg. It's always interesting to me, and over the years I've looked at this again and again, why particular speakers are attracted to particular subject matters. And in this particular case, it's really no surprise, because when I share with you Mitchell Adams' own background, I think you will see why he would be so much interested in the work of his legendary ancestor, particularly in the field of healthcare. 3 years ago, Mitchell Adams retired after 10 years as the executive director of the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, the state's development agency for the innovation economy and the advancement of technologies in healthcare that improve quality and reduce costs. Previously, he served as the Dean of Finance and Business at the Harvard Med School and as Vice Chancellor for Administration and Finance at UMass Medical Center. He has a distinguished record of over 30 years in leadership positions in the private and public sectors in regulation, law enforcement, healthcare, banking and investment management, real estate development, and in a variety of entrepreneurial ventures. Good heavens, rather imposing. As a state revenue commissioner from 1991 to 1998, he downsized the agency over 30% by introducing cutting-edge information technologies. He was the vice chair of Harvard's Board of Overseers, and he serves as a member of the Overseers Visiting Committees for Information Technology, the Harvard Business School, and Harvard College. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Athenaeum, and he served as a member of the Board of Directors at Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates from 1997 to 2006. So we are indeed delighted to have him with us today, and please join me in welcoming Mitchell Adams.
Thank you, Jane, for that very kind introduction. It's a privilege for me to be here, and this is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, as you know, and so this is a timely topic. This is my great-grandfather, Zabdiel Boylston Adams, a surgeon and a soldier for the Union. Before we get going, let me say a little bit about sources. We had the great fortune of having a whole chest full of letters, over 130 of them, and manuscripts by him. These were discovered by a surgeon in Framingham who created, with a grant from the Harvard Medical School, a biography in the early 80s, and this was supported by a grant from the Harvard Medical School and was part of the 200th anniversary of the Harvard Medical School and of the Massachusetts Medical Society in the early 80s. And so we have a rich source of information. Let me give you a capsule of this story to begin. The Civil War, as many of you know, was the bloodiest war by far in the nation's history. Over 600,000 were killed. That was 2% of the population. That was huge. And by comparison, the Second World War was 350,000 or so. Vietnam was 60,000, something like that. And so to put this in perspective, the Civil War was really deadly. This fellow's involvement was intense, and his commitment was intense. I would even describe it as fanatic. He began training for the war before it started, in the summer of 1860, he formed a group called the Cadets in Boston, and they did physical training to get ready for the war that they knew was coming. He enlisted immediately when Fort Sumter was fired upon. He was in the war throughout, from the beginning to the end, and in the course of it, he was wounded repeatedly, blinded or wounded, nearly killed, sent back to Boston, and then he re-enlisted. And he re-enlisted again and went back. He didn't have to go in the first instance. I mean, as we know, you could buy your way out of that conflict. You could have paid a surrogate. He didn't do that. And once when he applied for reinstatement and was declined, he appealed the refusal and went back anyway. And so one of the focuses of this talk is where did that fanaticism come from? Where did that intensity come from? And a look at his background and his family and the context in which he lived give us the answers, I think. It has to do with his intimate connection with the abolitionists in Boston. And it has to do with his very close family connection to the Founding Fathers. It was only a few generations away from Samuel Adams and John Adams, as we'll see. And I think we'll see themes in the story of courage and fearless dedication to the cause and to his role as a healing physician. Let me give you the background. So this is there he is in his captain's uniform. This is a family tree, and so this begins with the Boylston and the Adams family arriving on our shores, and Thomas Boylston up here and Henry Adams both arrived around 1632, 1633, and this is their descent. And one of the interesting things about our family is that there really is virtually a merger here between the Boylston family and the Adams family, where the daughters of Peter Boylston and the sons of Joseph Adams, those kids married one another. So Susanna married John, and Anne, her sister, married his brother Ebenezer. So this generation here, these are double first cousins because of this double marriage. The Boylston connection is interesting to us because you can see that my family line took this name and ran with it. So there are five generations of Zabdiel Boylston Adams here, and the subject of our talk is this one right here, the second one, Zabdiel Boylston Adams, born in 1829, died in 1902. These were all doctors, and they clearly were doing this in the naming in reverence to Dr. Zabdiel Boylston. Dr. Zabdiel Boylston is a fellow who, with Cotton Mather, inoculated for the first time in North America against smallpox in the epidemic of 1721. And he inoculated his family, his kids, and about 400 other Bostonians, and it worked. You got protection from the smallpox virus. Benjamin Franklin and others later were inoculated in that way. This is Nicholas Boylston, one of the cousins, and here is on this other side, on the Adams side of the family. Over here you have Samuel Adams, the firebrand of the American Revolution, and here you have John Adams and his son John Quincy. Again, double first cousins here, and only three generations here down from the second president to Dr. Adams here. And it's this connection with the Founding Fathers that I think is part of the story. I think that's part of the reason why he had a sense of the preservation of the Union. But there is a connection that is also very interesting when we get down to his immediate family right here. Let me show you the pictures of some of them. This is his father, who died in 1855. this is a photograph of a painting that I have that is a copy of the painting in the Framingham Library right now of Dr. Adams, and that was because he was one of the founders of the institution. This is his wife, Frances Kidder, whom they did not get along with one another. And we know this because all was not bliss, because there's an unsigned will that is part of the papers that we have, indicating that she leaves him nothing because he never did anything for me or my children, and he's not worth anything. It was not signed, and we don't know whether it was acted upon, but that's Frances Kidder. This is known in the family as Little Louisa. She died at the age of 6, and the family later had another Louisa, thus she was called Little Louisa, and this is from 1834. She was 6 years old. That's by Chester Harding. It's quite a nice picture. Here is Aunt Annie, and it is this connection that becomes very interesting and part of the story. This is a picture. This is a painting done on her in the year of her wedding in 1855, and here she is. Here she is in 1890. This is a portrait that is now in the Athenaeum by John Singer Sargent, which he did not as a commission. They were friends, and he gave it to her, and so that's why the family had it. What's interesting about Aunt Annie is that she had the most extraordinary life. She married James T. Fields. James T. Fields was America's literary publisher, and his firm was Ticknor and Fields. It later became Houghton Mifflin. Basically, his firm was the only game in town from 1845 on in terms of publishing literary material. And so all of the literary, I call them glitterati, and we'll list some of them here, were close friends. He published their work, and including Dickens. He was Dickens' agent in America, and he was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly. So they were in quite a position together. They were very close to my great-grandfather, and many of the letters from the Civil War, 130 or so, are letters from him during the war to his sister Annie or to her husband, James T. Fields. The connection, let me just give you a listing of some of the people who were their close friends. They had a wonderful and rich life. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a next-door neighbor on Charles Street. Hawthorne, Thoreau, Mark Twain was a close lifetime friend. Alfred Lord Tennyson, Dickens, as I said. The connection that is more interesting and germane here is the connection with the abolitionists. And they were close. They were very close. The Atlantic Monthly that Fields published was, like Garrison's Liberator, was a mouthpiece of the abolitionist movement. And so here is a listing of authors who were very close friends who were also abolitionists. Ralph Waldo Emerson, John Greenleaf Whittier, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Louisa May Alcott, and of course William Lloyd Garrison. But there are a couple that stand out in my mind, and this is Julia Ward Howe. And the reason that I throw her up there is because this is creating context. The Battle Hymn of the Republic appeared first on the front page of the Atlantic Monthly in February of 1862. And permit me to read the words, because these are the words that these folks were reading at the time. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on." The connection that is that even more significant is with Harriet Beecher Stowe. And there she is. Aunt Annie wrote 6 books in her own right. One of them was The Life and Letters of Harriet Beecher Stowe. So they were very close friends. Other Stowe biographers identify Aunt Annie as Harriet Beecher Stowe's most intimate, close friend. As you know, Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was an international bestseller and regarded by many as a formative and instrumental in the agitation that resulted in the Civil War. Lincoln's quote is famous, and apparently it's reported in many different places. He met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "Oh, so you're the little lady who started this war." Aunt Annie made an interesting comment in her book on Harriet Beecher Stowe. She describes their meeting in the spring of 1861, and she uses the following words. She said it was only a few weeks before the war against slavery was openly declared. And those words are important. Not everyone called it the war against slavery. You know, it was called a number of different things. To her, it was the war against slavery. And then she goes on to quote what Harriet Beecher Stowe said once when approached by a person who said, "Oh, I think your book is the best book ever written, and it was wonderful," and so on and so on. And Harriet Beecher Stowe replies, "I didn't write the book. God wrote the book. I'm just the scribe." One other point on this connection with the abolitionists. They lived at 148 Charles Street. It was just where Savinore's is now, and it's just steps away from the African Meeting House. So that's the context in which all of this was happening as my great-grandfather went off to war. Let me say a few things about his early education before the war. Like his forebearers, he went to Harvard College, and we know he went to Harvard College because we found him on the membership list in 1846 of the Institute of 1770. So we know he was there. Unlike his forebears, however, he did not graduate. He was thrown out. And here's why. There was an organization, I don't know if Bob Scott has heard about this. Bob Scott was part of Harvard as I was a while ago. There was an organization a long time ago called the MedFac, and it's a curious name. It stood for the medical faculty. It had nothing to do with the medical faculty. It was an organization for pranks. The name was chosen to reflect the medical benefits of a society whose embrace of the absurd diverted the mind from pain and sadness. That was MedFac. He was probably a member of MedFac because he was expelled from the university for a prank. And membership in the organization required that you conduct a prank serious enough to get expelled from the university for. And he did, and he was expelled. What he did with some others, but he was the only one who fessed up. President Everett arose and left his house promptly at 7:55 every morning and appeared at the chapel door at 8 p.m. precisely every single day, 7 days a week. But one day he didn't because the gate had been tied shut with ropes, and it was my great-grandfather who did it. He was late. He couldn't get out to the chapel, and he was late. He was thrown out. And the term was rusticated. He was rusticated to Bowdoin College, where he graduated in 1849. He went to the Harvard Medical School, like his father. An interesting point here, in 1851, he dove into the muddy river and saved a man who was drowning. And his name was Melville Jones. And one of the things that is at the Countway Library now in my great-grandfather's stuff is a silver medal that he was given by the Humane Society for rescuing Melville Jones. In 1853, many of us have read David McCullough's great book, The Greater Journey, Americans in Paris. In 1853, he went to Paris and spent a year, and that was part of your medical education, and a critical part of it, and it was true in art and many other, and music, but it was true in medicine. He returned to Boston as a surgeon in the period 1855 to 1860. and he formed a number of he was part of a number of medical societies. That was the way doctors did continuing education. And he was a member of the Boston Society for Medical Observation and the Boston Society for Medical Improvement. This brings us to the Civil War chapter. This extraordinary dedication is captured, I think, in some words of his about the war and why he did it and what was it about. He describes it as, he says, the cause was high and worthy and holy, and that was his attitude towards the war. He started. His involvement was, as I say, intense. He was involved in the Battle of Antietam, Gettysburg, the Battle of the Wilderness, the siege of Petersburg and the taking of Petersburg, and he was present at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The journey begins in Washington, D.C. He was commissioned an assistant surgeon in the 7th Massachusetts Volunteers. He writes Annie in August of 1861 about the White House, and he's amused to some extent. The battles haven't started yet. It's hot and it's the summer, and he writes as follows. He says, "The garden of the White House is sowed with chicken stuff, and the cows of the family graze in the enclosure where Madison's statue stands directly before the house. In short, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln of Springfield, Illinois, have gone to housekeeping in taking the White House in Washington. I believe they don't take any regular boarders yet." He goes on to say, "There is nothing of interest in Washington, which is a most shabby, magnificent place. Pigs and palaces, mud and marble, alley and avenue, shoddy and satin, tawdry and tremendous." He then goes on to talk about, you've seen the recent movie about Lincoln. He says he met the president, and he said he tells jokes all the time, and no one laughs at the jokes more heartily than the president himself. So that's a true story. In Gettysburg, this was one of his extraordinary experiences. He was in the thick of the battle at the so-called Bloody Wheat Field, and in fact, that's where he set up his operating theater. His regiment started with 210 men, and after 3 days, there were only 47 left. It was extraordinary. He personally worked nonstop as a surgeon for 2 days and 3 nights without stopping, at the end of which he collapsed and was blind. He'd lost his sight from exhaustion and went back to Boston. He was discharged to recuperate. He fortunately did recuperate, and he regained most of his sight. As Jane indicated, there are 2,000 monuments at Gettysburg, but only one to a physician, and it is to he, and it was established by his regiment after the war. And what it says is, it says on the plaque that he established his operating tables so near the line of battle. Many of our wounded escaped capture or death by its timely aid, meaning that he figured out that you can't have the operating tables hundreds of yards back from the battle because half of the men were bleeding to death on the way there. So you had to set it up right by where the action was and do it right there. And obviously it was perilous. Let me just indulge me for a minute, because we don't read this enough, and it's short. Let me read the Gettysburg Address, because that's the context here. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, and that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or to detract. The world will little note, no long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The Battle of the Wilderness was the next major conflict that he was in, although I failed to mention that before Gettysburg he was in the Peninsular Campaign in 1862, and he was hard at work as a surgeon at the Battle of Antietam, at which the bloodiest day of the war happened. 23,000 were killed in one day, and which is hard to imagine, but that's what happened at Antietam. In the Battle of the Wilderness, we're back now to just after Gettysburg. Soon after his return to Boston, he regained his sight, and he enlisted as soon as he could. At that point, and I believe it was because his vision was somewhat impaired, he couldn't function as a surgeon, he became a captain in the 56th Massachusetts Volunteers in the infantry. And he was commissioned in January of 1864 and returned to the South. The Battle of the Wilderness begins on the 5th of May, 1864. He had a comparable experience to Gettysburg in that his company, he writes, started with 45 men, and 25 of them were killed or lost in battle. He was seriously wounded on the 6th of May with both bones of his left leg shattered, and he was captured immediately and suffered terribly over the following weeks because he basically wasn't getting the kind of attention that he needed, and he was exposed to the elements, and it was pretty awful. He has some descriptors here of that. Let me. So this is I should have flipped these up. One of these is the Wilderness, and then Gettysburg, and then the Battle of that's the wheat field, and so that's the Wilderness. This is a map that he drew of where he was hit and fell at the Battle of the Wilderness, and it's small, it's hard to read. In the best of circumstances, it's in brown ink and red ink, but he shows the different roads here, the orange plank road, and here he makes a little red X, and that is X is the place where I fell and was captured. And that's the Battle of the Wilderness. Here is a letter that he wrote to his mother, and it's in a pencil actually, and you can't read the text here, but we can capture it here. We've lost the top of it, but anyway, my dear mother, I was wounded and taken prisoner on the 6th of May in the Battle of the Wilderness. The regiment broke badly, and so forth. Colonel Weld, who was a family friend, was near me, and so forth. And then he describes basically what happened to him and how he fell. At this point, he says, I've been very well treated by the rebel soldiers. That was up and down. He was well treated and badly treated, as we'll see. And then he talks about not having proper shelter and so forth. This is a PS right here. General Wadsworth expired by my side. General Wadsworth was one of the most famous of the Union generals. Major General James Wadsworth took a bullet in the back of his head and lay weakening for several days and died they were together in this. His description of his experience after he was wounded and captured is really quite stunning. Let me read you a couple of pieces of it. He's in the field and exposed, and he writes, "It seems like a horrid nightmare. The groans and complaints of the wounded sufferers, the foul stench, the tormenting gnats and flies, the pain and fever, thirst, vomiting, and diarrhea, the sense of loneliness and abandonment, everyone around me being utter strangers, the back raw from lying on the ground, the hot sun against which the scanty foliage of the low trees afforded little protection, the maggots which got into my wounds. How can I tell all the horror of that time?" In another episode, he writes of a very interesting little story. He writes, "In the Confederate Field Hospital, the next morning I was aroused by something tickling my face and dripping down upon me from above. I wiped my face and was surprised to find blood. I looked around me and I found that I was under a low canopy made with 4 uprights like a 4-posted bedstead, having a poncho stretched over it as a kind of stretcher. Men wearing white aprons were standing around, and in close proximity to my head was the leg of a man severed from his body. I spoke, and somebody stepped back and looked under the poncho. 'Hello, how did you come here?' Or some such words. They pulled me out and all laughed heartily at my predicament, which was that I had been put in the darkness underneath the operating table, unperceived by any of the surgeons, and had slept there soundly until roused as above." Then he goes on briefly to say, "Soon a consultation was held over my case. After waiting many hours, the surgeons, Doctors Miner and Gaston, who smelled pretty strongly of whiskey, came and examined my wounds, and after midday I was placed upon, not under, the operating table and chloroformed." Then he writes, remember his leg has been shattered and he's in a very bad way. "Gangrene attacked my wounds on the very night following the consultation of surgeons spoken of above. This, however, I managed to subdue by pouring pure nitric acid in, which I did myself, although the pain was almost unendurable." And finally, he writes of a period of time in which they were put in a building, all crammed, overcrowded in the building, I'm sure. "To the warm sympathy and kindness of the Negroes we owe, I think, our preservation under all these privations. Food of good quality, although of course in small quantity, was brought secretly to us or hoisted in at the windows by night. I find in my diary that on Thursday, June 9th, an extra guard was placed around the building to prevent our receiving these supplies at night. Once or twice we knew that the Negroes were detected and whipped. One of them, whom we called Aunt Dosia, under pretense of doing laundry work, came nearly every day with snacks of one kind or another." So that is the wilderness battle. He goes back to he's incarcerated for a long time. I think 4 months. It is 4 months in Libby Prison near Richmond, and there was a prisoner exchange, and he was sent back to Boston and discharged. Immediately after receiving his discharge notice, he applied for reinstatement to go back. He was refused. He appealed and was once again reinstated. And in the early spring of 1865, he saw action again at the Battle of Petersburg. He was wounded again, this time a bullet in his left shoulder. The battle was won in a short period of time. He was present at Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in the second week of April. So that's the Civil War. The rest of his experience is somewhat less dramatic, although there was a little bit of a drama. He stays in Boston for a while, and followed his father's footsteps in creating a number of medical societies. One of which was founded by him. It was called the Roxbury Society for Medical Improvement, and he founded it with others in 1867. Again, this was a continuing education. They met regularly to talk about what worked and what didn't work, and what have you learned. That society functions today, and it meets quarterly. And I was privileged a couple of years. How I got going on developing this talk. They asked me to come and speak to them about him at one of their quarterly meetings. And so I began to develop this story at a meeting of the Roxbury Society for Medical Improvement, founded in 1867. He moved to Framingham in that year, and that's where he spent the last 3 decades as a doctor. Long hours, very little pay, often no pay. He became engaged in civic matters increasingly over these years, and was one of the founders of the Framingham Library, which is why that portrait of him as an older man exists. It hangs in the library today. He was a founder of the Framingham Hospital, later the Framingham Union Hospital, and in 1900, when they got their first X-ray machine, he discovered that the notion he had had for 35 years that he still harbored a bullet in his leg was not true. He thought the bullet was still there. It was not. The X-ray proved it wasn't. He was active in the Framingham Board of Health, and in the early days, these boards of health were active places. He became the medical examiner for Framingham, and he became a counselor to the Massachusetts Medical Society. He was honored by the Massachusetts Medical Society by his election as vice president in 1894, and then in 1897 he was selected as orator for the annual discourse. In public life, he stood out in a number of ways. He often would be a combatant in the controversy about vaccination, and he was always for it, and there were always people who were against it, but his position was always clear. As medical examiner, he was vocal in opposition to MDs being paid for expert testimony in court. He thought that was inappropriate, shouldn't happen. I suppose he assumes that they should do it gratis as professionals. He died at the age of 72 in 1902. Let me just wrap up here to show you what happened beyond him. With these people named Zabdiel, Boylston, Adams. That's his son, my grandfather, also a surgeon in Boston, an orthopedic surgeon. And here they are. This is an assembly of a bunch of them. Oops. I've screwed up completely. You know what? We'll just look at this in. If someone were able, they could do this, but I'm not. So. Okay, there we are. So, my grandfather is there. This is his son, Zabdiel Boylston Adams. That's my grandmother, Gagu, my Aunt Nancy, and my father, Samuel. And so that's the crew. Let me just say 2 more things in wrapping up here. He wrote late in life about his whole life, and what was meaningful, and he says that service in the Civil War was most meaningful to him in defense of the certainty and unity of the nation and the overthrow of a despotic and inhumane oligarchy. And finally he said, of war, war is for beasts. There should never be another one on earth. Thank you very much.
And if you'd be willing to take some questions or reflections, I think we have many.
Happy to. In this crowd, there are people who know a great deal more about this than I do, and it's very intimidating. Yes, sir.
Did the rusticated young man graduate from Boylston College?
He did. He graduated.
Thank you.
With,
From Boylston 57.
that's reassuring, isn't it? Yeah. Yes.
Was it a common practice for medical students to go to Paris, and what was the purpose of it?
It was not uncommon. Interesting question as to what percentage of people graduating from medical school went to Paris. I don't know the answer to that, but it wasn't unusual, and there were others who went. Oliver Wendell Holmes went, Bowditch went, some other of the leadership of the Harvard Medical School went to Paris, and they'd go for a year or two. And as McCullough's book shows, it was happening. Paris was the place to be in the middle of the 19th century. But I don't know how many physicians.
What was the purpose of it?
Oh, it was to learn medicine. The feeling was that the French physicians had the best medical practice, and that that's where you could really learn the practice of medicine is from the French. Yeah. Yes.
I'm very interested in this bout of blindness. You attributed it to being up and exhausted after, it sounds like 72 hours.
Mm.
But blindness is, I don't know, it's caused by exhaustion. So I think there's probably another explanation for it. Do you know any more of the circumstances?
No, I don't, and that's a very interesting point because it's a puzzlement. Newt Peabody, who wrote this wonderful little book and was a surgeon in Framingham, didn't say anything more about it than basically what I've said. He was exhausted and he lost his sight. And Peabody did not editorialize on it. He didn't.
And any idea of the duration for it recurring, his sight recurring? You don't know how fast it came back?
No.
You said he was affected by that, but he went on to practice medicine for decades.
He did, yeah.
So it was likely emotional.
It certainly could have been. It certainly, right, it could have been. And stress, yeah. Would stress do? Are you a physician?
Yes, I am.
Would stress do it?
I think it's much more an emotional experience than a fatigue. And you can imagine him being up that long and seeing all the gore and trying to help these kids that were dying. That it was a severe emotional experience.
Right. You know, it's so interesting that you say that. In the back there's some pictures of his company, and some of them are 15, 16 years old. They're kids. Jerry.
Mitch, as a psychologist, I could say that the literature from Freud on talks about the psychiatric side of hysterical blindness that is documented fairly broadly, so that it's quite possible that we're talking about something that has an emotional or non-organic basis that has occurred many times in many different circumstances to people. But Mitch, I wanted to ask while I have you, so what was his family's reaction to these frequent re-enlistment, going back and forth after being practically wiped out each time, and still, it seemed that he was on good terms with him. Did anyone ever try to talk him out of going back?
Yeah, I don't know the answer. My assumption has been that he's our brother, the hero. I think his immediate family looked at the Civil War in the same as he described it. And if you were an intimate friend of Harriet Beecher Stowe's, you probably would look at things that way. I would think. And in Boston, there was a furor. There was a lot going on, but certainly the abolitionists were raging. And yes.
You said that after he was blinded, he came back as an officer, but not as a physician. Was he a physician in any subsequent time while still in service?
No, he wasn't. Yes, Peter.
Along the same point, this question of coming back as an infantry officer rather than a physician, that's essentially remains in the service but changes what he's doing, takes place right at the same time that he's recovering from this problem with his vision. I was also struck by the fact that he's, relative to people he's serving with, he's a mature man. Careful what I say here, but he's 34 at this time, which is old for a lieutenant in the infantry in the Civil War, and at the end of the Civil War. And I think that's also really, I wonder if you've thought about that he's not, this isn't the blush of youth that he's enlisting at, but someone who's had a substantial life experience.
Yes,
I'm really fascinated by how he, in the heat of battle, is able to recognize the importance of not losing any time at all by having the operating facilities right there. And I'm wondering if eventually did the Sanitary Commission pick up on what he had done? Is there evidence that there was an effect of that beyond what was going on right in Gettysburg in 1863?
I do not
So it
know.
would be fascinating
Yeah.
to know that, yeah.
I do not know. Yes, Bob.
I know very little about this. This is an innovation of Napoleon, which was to have the medical people right close to the front line, as close as you could reasonably get them. It goes along with Napoleon's idea of doing everything quickly, and it tremendously reduced the death rate. Napoleon wasn't doing it for loving reasons, but for practical reasons.
Yeah, right. Yes.
It was Baron Leray, who was Napoleon's surgeon, who developed the sort of ambulance corps of taking wounded off the battlefield during the battle, as opposed to before the Napoleonic Wars, the people who were wounded would stay on the field until the battle was over. So that was the innovation that Baron Leray did. He also said that the only one who profits from war is a surgeon.
The only one who profits is the surgeon?
Yeah.
Yes.
So Mitchell, Frances Kinder came from a very prominent family herself, right?
I don't know about that.
Well, anyway, when she wrote that thing about, and that was long after the Civil War, right?
I assume that it was, yes.
Oh, you don't know?
It's not dated and it's not
Oh, yeah.
signed. Yeah.
Well, Mitchell mentioned the little exhibit up in the back, and I do want to mention that our senior librarian and exhibits coordinator, Peter Drummy, has, as he always does for our programs, put up an exhibit of some of the materials directly related to this talk, and we want to make sure that you take a look at those if you haven't seen them already. And please, again, join me in thanking Mitchell.